live. This is a series that I started a while back. Hi, welcome, Alicia. Part of my one-woman campaign to demystify the process of being a podcast guest, particularly as a health and wellness professional. You know by now that I believe it's one of the most powerful yet underutilized strategies we have. Hey, Alex, welcome. For marketing ourselves, I thought, maybe it would be helpful if I just did a casual, like we're on the floor of my office, welcome, a casual live to kind of pull back the curtain whenever I am a guest on someone else's podcast and just kind of talk you through the experience with an eye toward clearing the mist of confusion and hopefully injecting some can-do spirit in you so that this is something you actually feel equipped to do, because trust me, you're more than ready. Podcast episode in question this time is my conversation that went live this week with Julie Ralston on her excellent podcast, Go To Wellness Pro. Julie is a web designer who specializes in working with health and wellness professionals, and it was just a dream to be on her podcast. She's just one of those people that's very, very easy to talk to. And then share just some little nuggets that you can take with you in your own podcast outreach. And then at the very end, I'll point you towards some next steps if you're looking for more support pitching yourself as a podcast guest. Chose this one because it was a common one. I heard from several of you that were wondering about this. And I'm also sort of cheekily teeing up next week's content. I'm going to be covering this topic of call to action buttons specifically. It's a very specific topic, but there's lots to say about it because even though it's what we'd consider micro copy, it's just an itty bitty little bit of text on your website or wherever else you have them. There's a lot of thought that can go into it, and when we find people using calls to action effectively, there's often a tremendous amount of back-end research and testing that's gone into it. So I want to make sure that you have some helpful guidance as far as how you can go about doing testing in your business with your people. So the question was how to balance cleverness and clarity on call to action buttons. And that's an outstanding question. If you're here watching this now, can you just let me know, is this something that you've struggled with in your own business? It's like, should I just say what the button leads to? Like, should I say the thing like subscribe or sign up? Or should I try and sprinkle in a little of my own unique charm into the copy? Almost always, whether we're talking about call to action buttons, or anything else in your copy, clear is always the winner. Clear is what is going to actually make our communication land on the other side. And so I'm always going to vote for clear over clever. That said, we don't have to choose one or the other. Because the button only gives us so much real estate, I think it feels higher stakes. It's like, what words do I actually use? And so again, I'm going to get into all of this in much more detail in the coming week when I theme out the whole week talking about this. You can play around with different styles of call to action on your buttons on the same page. Let's just take a sales page, for instance. Typically, I would recommend there just being one clear call to action, right? The sales page is designed to move them toward one outcome. You can have lots of different versions of calls to action that are pointing toward that same thing. And so one might say, count me in, or tell me more. And another might say, I'm ready to enroll, or enroll in, or like sign me up for, and then the name of your actual offer. Again, if this is piquing your curiosity or you want more on this, meet me back here next week and we'll get into all of that goodness. This is a case where I was invited. Julie invited me to be a guest on her podcast. And the way that happened, we hadn't known each other long. In fact, Julie slid into my DMs early this summer and was asking about my copy support services because as a web designer, she was shopping around for copy support on behalf of one of the clients that she was working with. And so she said some nice things about my content, asked me some questions. I got back to her as quickly as I could, shared some information about how I work with clients from a copy standpoint. And then I hopped over to her website, and then I came back. Hey, I happen to love the copy on your website. So we were just chatting about how we work with clients, really. Julie is what I would consider a professional neighbor. These are people who are supporting or speaking to the same population as you, but supporting them in an adjacent, in a related but different way. Julie is a great example of that. And she said, oh, and by the way, I have a podcast and I would love to have you on. Would you be interested? So I'm going to come back to this when I talk about lessons, but this is, to me, a great reminder that you never quite know what these relationships will lead to. When someone pops into your DMs or comments on a piece of your content or sends you, hi, welcome, or sends you an email, our brains want so badly to make order of it and categorize them. Julie is reaching out. She's a potential referral source, maybe. As it can be tempting to try and categorize these contacts when we get them from new people, you just never know. You could have all kinds of different avenues of collaboration with folks. They could just become a really good friend. So anyway, when she invited me on the podcast, I did what I would consider like a mini version of a pitch. So let's pretend that she hadn't invited me and I reached out to her pitching some different topics. I took basically the same approach. I just did it right there in the DMs after she invited me. So what I said was, well, first I thanked her, and then I went and I listened to some recent episodes of her podcast back, and then I skimmed through to see what other topics she'd covered. Not exhaustively, but I took some time to do it. And so I came back and I was able to say to her, yes, thank you so much. I would love to. Based on a review of other topics you've covered on your podcast so far, I'm wondering if any of these topics would be helpful to your audience. Boom, boom, boom. I gave her 3 options. And then I said, but of course, I'm happy to brainstorm further. That right there is like a little mini version of what you do in an effective pitch. Because then what it allowed her to do is to took some of the onus off of her, so she doesn't have to generate ideas out of thin air. She could look at the list of things I feel qualified to talk about, and she could pick one. And because I'd already gone in and said, okay, I know for sure she hasn't covered specifically these topics, it saves her the step of having to come back and say, I like that topic, but we've just covered that, It's kind of just using your common sense and being a good collaborator. And so she came back and was very decisive. She said, let's do this option, and said, I like that one because it's so actionable. And at this time of year, I think my audience is really looking for bite-sized tips that they can implement right away. And boom, that's how our topic was born. But do you see what I mean? It's about kind of curating a list of options, and so that you give them 3. You don't give them a million different topics. And then the host can work with you and tell you what would work well. And so from there, we just kind of put a finer point on it. We scheduled it and away we went. On the actual interview, it was remarkably free of tech issues. It was actually little tech issues happen all the time, and there was nothing like that, at least as far as I could remember. We just did audio. Sometimes hosts will ask to capture some video as well. I'm seeing more and more that hosts are using video to help promote the episode. And so it's still distributed in audio form primarily by most hosts, but then they'll use little snippets of video to help push it out and drum up interest on social channels, that kind of thing. So it was audio, so I was able to be in my PJs. One thing I want to mention though is actually the opposite of any surprises or issues. Julie, when we were scheduling, gave me lots of different options in terms of time of day when I can do it. And so I deliberately chose a time of day and a date when I knew I would have nothing else going on beforehand. And that is something you don't always have the luxury of being able to pick your ideal time. Sometimes the host is up against a time crunch or there's only so many options. But as someone who has done podcast interviews at all different times of week and day, and in some cases has had to kind of slot them in a bit of a time crunch between 2 other things, I really recommend, if you can, choosing a time of day when you know your energy is going to be pretty high and you don't have a lot occupying your mind. And so because we recorded in the morning on a day when I had nothing else going on that morning, I was able to bop around and have my coffee. I recorded a little, I think I posted a couple of stories of me sitting here just saying, getting ready to hop on a podcast interview, and then I tagged Julie. But that was really all I did in the morning. And I just, I don't know if this would be noticeable to someone else listening, but we always pay closer attention to ourselves. And listening back to our conversation this week, I really can hear a difference in my voice. I just sound a lot more grounded. That wouldn't necessarily be the case for other people. If you're not a morning person, if you're decidedly lower energy in the morning, then you could choose your preferred time of day. But I do think it makes a difference. So I just wanted to share that as well. And then the final thing I want to share behind the scenes is the repurposing plans that we've made. And so Julie had given me a heads up of timeline, and what that enabled me to do was plan ahead for scheduling this. I know that whenever an episode goes live, I try to do an after the episode live fairly soon after it. It allowed me to batch some content in Canva to be able to post on social media. I was able to plan out my blog post that would talk about the podcast episode and link to our conversation in that blog post. It just gives you a little bit of lead time. And so that's something to be thinking about, is if the host doesn't happen to tell you, they won't always know exactly when it's going to go live, but it's always okay to ask, just because then it helps you be a better co-collaborator. The other thing we've been doing is sharing each other's graphics and stories about this. And that's really helpful just because it's another piece of content. It's another, not everyone who follows us is always going to see everything we post, right? Unfortunately. And so it's helpful to have kind of this co-pal who's helping get more eyes on your episode. So that's something that has been really helpful. The other thing I want to say is that when I was coming up with ideas to pitch to Julie after she invited me to join her on her podcast, I was already thinking, and I wouldn't know to do this when I first started out, but now that I've done this enough times, I'm trying to think of ways to streamline the process. And what I can tell you is podcast episodes are so ripe for repurposing. There's so many ways to pull out little gems and nuggets and repurpose them in creative ways and share them out with your audience, that if you can save yourself having to reinvent the wheel, you should. And so as I was coming up with the topic, I was already thinking, okay, is this going to have some talking points that I can then repurpose as sections of a blog post, that I can then pull out one and make it a reel, or I can summarize these 5 points in a carousel post. Do you know what I mean? It's like you want to be just thinking ahead to all the ways you'll repurpose this, and that is going to give you kind of a rough outline of your talking points. And in case you haven't done this before, I'm not saying script out every word you're going to say on an episode. Not at all. I'm a fan of preparing judiciously, meaning like a few talking points. My last point here that I want to make, to be open to new connections. So just as I said, when Julie reached out to me, at the time we weren't talking about me being a podcast guest, and yet that's where the conversation took us. So as best you can, try to view every interaction you have with someone new as a potential, like all kinds of different ways you could work together and ways that you could collaborate. We just never know. And sometimes creative opportunities present themselves whether or not we're looking for them. And the reverse is true as well. Like you can be reaching out to people, even if you're not entirely sure how you want to work together, you can just reach out and start getting to know them, start chatting in the DMs, start building a relationship, especially if you share a common audience. The next takeaway is to set yourself up for success in terms of energy. So I shared that I really enjoyed hopping on to record this interview with Julie in the morning when I have more energy usually, and it was not a hectic morning. I was able to be up here, have it be nice and quiet, and then get onto our call, and I felt just very present with her. And I think that it made for a more pleasant recording experience for sure, but I think it also helped me be that much more attentive to our conversation. And then my final point is outline your talking points with repurposing in mind. As I said, try to be thinking a couple steps ahead to how you might want to repurpose and reshare parts of this episode, and then you can work backwards and plan accordingly. If you're watching this later, please drop a comment, or you're welcome to DM me. I'm always happy to talk about this. And thanks so much for being here, and see you next week.